Okay, so this video is just to go a little bit more into depth on Anglo-Saxon culture now that you kind of have an idea of how the Germanic tribes infiltrated England and some of the sort of systems that they put in place. So, sort of to return to Christian or to practices before Christianity really takes over, we know that in pre-Christian Anglo-Saxon religious systems, the sources are really limited because they aren't writing anything down by themselves. So most of what we know come from the Christians who were attempting to convert. So obviously, they're going to have a fair amount of subjectivity and bias. A lot of times they're very sort of derisive, they're mocking, they don't really understand the practices, so we know there's some distortion. But we do know that some of these practices sort of are reflected in just certain things that endure, like the days of the week. So they did have sort of a hierarchy of divine powers, gods, goddesses, elves. They believed in ghosts. Some of that translates into things like the days of the week. So the god Woden is sort of associated with Wednesday, and the goddess Freya with Friday. We do know that, as we talked about before, there's this concern being able to control, especially natural forces, gain good fortune. And then to do that, you have to make offerings to the powers that be. So animal sacrifices does seem to be somewhat prevalent. And then on occasion, though this seems really, really rare, they would employ human sacrifice as well. And then they were very much into sort of auspices. So priests or sort of religious experts would be able to sort of predict certain outcomes. So if you do this, this might happen. This is very common in sort of pre-modern religions generally. So we do see, like in some burial sites, they have crystals that were buried with them that seem to be associated with sort of good luck or good fortune. Also amulets like the ones pictured here. These came from an archaeological site dated to the Anglo-Saxon period. So these are sort of spear-shaped amulets. So probably, and the ones on the side are sort of axes. So probably like an amulet that a warrior would have worn into battle to give them good luck. And eventually, though, as we see, Christianity does take over, and in part, there is a really pragmatic element to this. Conversion does seem to be driven by the kings. It sort of stems from the royal courts. The kings are the ones that these sort of ambassadors of the church, whether the Celtic church or the Roman Catholic church, sort of reach out to. So this is really a top-down conversion initially, and some of the appeal seems to be, like I said, very sort of practical. So the church does sort of offer kings certain mechanisms of state formation, sort of tools to expand their authority, to consolidate their authority. The clergy in and of themselves really do provide sort of an administrative officer that kings can use, and in many respects sort of liturgy and religious practice are sort of associated with sort of early forms of law. If you think about law as just a way to regulate behavior, so what you can do and what you can't do according to the church very much regulates behavior. And then also these clergy, remember, are literate, so they know Latin, they can read and write, and that's very unusual in the rest of the population. So kings use them to draw up charters, to write letters, to write laws, and so they serve as a sort of a pragmatic function that way. There also does seem to be some attraction just from the ceremony that sort of accompanied particularly Roman Catholic beliefs and practices, sort of the distinction, because the king would have been sort of at the center of most of those practices, or sort of an elevation of his authority along sort of a spiritual plane. And then we also know that early on, the royal families of the Heptarchy were very much active as royal patrons. So because they had the resources and the means, they could give them to monastic foundations. We do know that it's not uncommon. So for example, female members of the royal family to become nunneries, particularly during this period to become abbesses, so in control of a nunnery, which was actually a really, really powerful position. You have a lot of land and wealth and resources at your disposal. This is an example of a royal foundation, the Abbey of Whitby, which was very much associated with some of the royal families in England. And you can see from the structure, quite an imposing structure given the time, even though now it's sort of in ruins. They also become active in building churches, which are also called minsters. So, for example, Westminster, one of the most sort of iconic buildings in England, starts out as a church. So that gave them a way to sort of demonstrate their power and their wealth, and was sort of a physical manifestation of their authority. So shifting to the economy, what we start to see as these kings establish control, as society becomes a little bit more stable, more agricultural settlements emerge. And this is a recreated village at Westow. So Westow is an Anglo-Saxon settlement that's been extensively excavated. And so we know a lot about the layout of the village and what it would have looked like. I don't know if any of you have been to like Jamestown, these sort of modern recreations of historic sites. So this is an Anglo-Saxon site that you can visit in England. And so you can kind of get a sense of the size and the materials that would have been used in the construction of these Anglo-Saxon settlements. So many of them relocate to places that have more productive land, sort of thicker, denser agricultural soils. And so they're able to really begin to sort of cultivate the soil in a concentrated fashion in ways they hadn't done previously. And one of the reasons why this happens is that kings realize that they need a more sort of regular source of income, that plunder just isn't sort of reliable enough. And so if they have these estates, if they have these agricultural workers on these estates, then they can support the king's household, and they can also support sort of the economy moving forward. So it's very common early on then for these emerging kings to grant various estates to sort of some of their closest supporters as sort of a way to reward service. But then also it puts someone in place who can sort of oversee that particular settlement and be sort of the legal presence of the king, the legal representative of the king, and also sort of exact tribute and taxes. One of the things we do see at this time, though, in part because of the need for agricultural labor, is an increase in unfree dependents. So these are individuals who are tied to the land. They don't own the land themselves. They sort of work the estates of the nobility. But it does expand the amount of land subject to cultivation, and we begin to see an increase in agricultural productivity across England. They also become a little bit more savvy in their exploitation of natural resources. In particular, we date this to the time of the introduction of water mills, and you can see this manuscript illumination at the bottom. So there's the river and there's the mill. And so this helps to grind the grain, and it becomes much more efficient. This would have been something that the local noble would have built and paid for, and then the people on the estate can use it, but they have to sort of pay him, usually in kind, for the use of the mill, but dramatically increases production. We also have a lot of evidence of fish weirs. These are like traps, like you would use sort of wood or reeds, and you would sort of build a trap, and then as the fish swim up the river, they get caught in the trap. So a much more sort of effective, efficient way of sort of utilizing the natural resources provided by the rivers. Fish would have been a staple of the diet during this period. Also, eels were very common, and we see that reflected in a lot of sort of documentation from the period. So these would have been sort of freshwater eels, and anything else, other sorts of marine life. We also see the expansion of pasture, as evidenced by sort of the construction of pens for sheep, in some instances of stone, and then the specialization of labor at this time occurs as well. So we see growth in the pottery industry. We start to see smiths. We start to see sort of proto-manufacturing happen, and this is all possible in part because you just have that stability in place. You're not worried about being attacked, so you can focus your energies on being more productive. And so in the 7th century, we see the growth of what are called emporia. So these are sort of manufacturing and trading centers. And there are sort of a handful of these that dot England. And then across Western Europe, France, Germany, Scandinavia had a number of these as well. So these are places that, in part because of their location, in part because they're maybe centrally located or on a port, just have sort of natural advantages for this type of exchange. This is a diagram of the Emporia of Hamwich. And we know that in part because the kings are providing more stability, it becomes safer to travel these land routes and these sea routes. And that safety then translates into sort of increased trade and increased exchange. And so there's this really fairly impressive widespread movement of goods as well as people in the form of traders, but also in the form of slaves. And so they're importing things like pottery. They're importing things like pepper from the east, silk. We also know they're bringing in ivory. We see signs in archaeological investigations of sort of various vessels coming all the way from the Byzantine Empire, whale bones. So a lot of products that would be fairly sort of exotic and probably destined for noble households. But then they're also exporting lots of metals that they're mining, also cloths and agricultural produce. And then obviously slaves would be a sort of a present component of this exchange. So the political system then begins to evolve and become a little bit more sophisticated, very hierarchical. So you have a king who is sort of obviously at the top of the hierarchy, generally chosen by the Witan, sort of a council of advisors. This is a precursor to parliament. Usually the kings came from a particular family. So it's a combination of heredity and being elected. Below kings, you have this group of people called aldermen. Aldermen probably were some initially members of the king's family, members of the household, so very close to the king. And then these are eventually going to evolve into sort of earls and dukes. But they do have to control a certain amount of land to sort of qualify to be sort of at the top of this hierarchy. And aldermen have sort of important administrative powers. They control shires, which are sort of the precursor to the counties in England. So these are administrative units. So they'll collect taxes and oversee the courts. They are also in charge of organizing the fyrd. The fyrd is the royal militia. So it's a sort of a temporary fighting force. It's not a standing army. And so when the king needs to summon the fyrd, the aldermen sort of go into the countryside and organize those local militias, and then they assemble to fight. Below them, you have thanes. This is sort of the equivalent to a knight. In order to be a thane initially, it depended upon how much land you controlled. So 5 hides of land. A hide of land is sort of the Anglo-Saxon equivalent to the acre. It's just sort of an arbitrary unit of land. But 5 hides was considered sort of the prerequisite to be at that level. And obviously, they would have owed certain services to the king as well. Below then you have this large group of people called carls. These are peasants. These are free peasants and they're unfree peasants. There's, depending on the sources and different historical viewpoints, there are a number of different sort of positions within this particular subgroup, depending upon how much land you have, if you own land, or sort of the level of your dependency. And then at the very bottom, you have the slaves, who obviously are not free. They are usually the product of conquest or the product of sort of raiding. And so they are sort of at the bottom of the hierarchy. And you can kind of see in this manuscript, to some degree, an illustration of this hierarchy. So you have sort of the local official in charge of these peasants who are working the land. And then ultimately a lot of that agricultural produce is going to find its way to the king's household. So these shires, as I talked about before, are first sort of introduced in Wessex and then gradually extended into Mercia and then will eventually cover all of England. And they literally leave their mark in terms of some of the names. So places like Wiltshire, Hampshire, and these were early administrative units. Some of them corresponding with the small sub-kingdoms of sub-Roman Britain. And so in place of, in each shire, you have a reeve. So shire reeve eventually becomes combined into the term sheriff, who is sort of a local official in charge, and he answers to the aldermen. And then you also have in each shire a justice of the peace. So this is an individual responsible for sort of overseeing the legal system, which I'll talk about in a second. So if there's a crime, it's brought to the attention of the justice of the peace. He is very much the king's sort of man on the ground. So we talk about the king's justice. All justice stems from the king. The king is the source of all sort of legal decisions, laws, and so the justice is the king's representative within the shire. And then the shire reeve is sort of the person in charge of the day-to-day collection of taxes or tributes, and he also helps organize the fyrd when necessary. And the Anglo-Saxon legal system is still very much influenced by sort of Germanic tradition. So at the center, we still have ordeal. Ordeal is a particular type of legal practice where you're trying to determine if someone committed a crime. This is an illustration from a little bit later on of ordeal by fire. So if someone within the community accuses you of a crime and you deny it, then you sort of say, okay, let's let God figure it out. So as you can see, he picked up a coal. So you put like an iron bar in a fire until it gets glowing hot. And then the person accused of the crime picks it up. He holds it for a certain amount of time and then he lets go. His hand is wrapped. There are very specific instructions. He can't put salve on it. He can't treat it. And if his hand then, after a certain amount of days, if he's still alive, then clearly he's innocent. And so this is sort of this idea that God will intervene. But also it's fear, right? If you really believe that if you're lying, you're not going to pick up the iron coal. They also extract oaths from every male who's 12 and up within the community to observe the peace. So if you see any crime within the community, you're obligated to denounce it. This also is, these oaths are also sort of prevalent throughout this hierarchy as a way to sort of secure loyalty. On the ground, eventually you have the organization of what are called 100 courts. So these are sort of local courts then that can deal with these local disputes. And in a lot of instances, what we see punishment is still very much about sort of retribution. So if you are committed of a crime, if you are found guilty, not only can you be punished, but your kin can be punished as well. And in many ways, this is intended to be this is one of the king's sort of largest challenges, is just keeping order within the community and cutting down on any sort of crimes. And so it's a real retributive justice, right? So it's not just on you, your entire family or your kin could pay, they could lose possessions, they could lose lives in some instances. So it's intended to really discourage crime from happening, which explains sort of why it's very sort of punitive in nature.